Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Caffeinated Christian Podcast. I am one of your hosts, Mike Rigglesworth, and I'm here again with Ryan Willard. Ryan, how are you doing today?
Good. How you guys doing?
Dr. Ryan, good to see you. Good to see you.
Yeah.
So we are in part 3 of a 3-part series called Why Christianity. And if you've been following with us in this series, we have looked at some of the reasons why it makes logical sense to believe in the truth claims of Christianity. We took a look at the reliability of the Gospels. Last time, we also took a look at the existence of God, and so you could watch those or listen to those at your leisure. And today, we are going to be getting into the reasons why it makes the most sense to believe in the resurrection of Jesus. And so I can't wait to talk about that. We're going to be talking about some of the opposing theories to the resurrection and what are some of the bedrock historical facts of the resurrection that even skeptical scholars hold to and believe. And so I'm going to be interviewing Ryan on those questions. But before we do, we're going to get into 2 things today. First, we're going to get into the coffee that we're drinking. Ryan, what are you drinking today?
So I made a coffee today, and I'm not going to be drinking it because it tastes like I'm just spraying my wife's perfume in the back of my mouth.
That's horrible.
It's from Seattle's Best, and I love the decaf, regular, mild, mid, whatever they want to call it, version of it. I have it all the time. When my parents come over, that's what we make. It's fantastic. But I got I went in the Kroger aisle, and I saw it's like Vanilla Blast or Vanilla Burst or something like that.
Yeah.
And I just brewed a cup, and it's right here, and I'm not going to drink it because I cannot stand the flavor of it. It's quite terrible.
You regret your choice.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
and sometimes we have good coffee, sometimes we have bad ones, and if they're bad, I'm going to let you know it's bad.
I mean, we've had coffee that's tasted like garbage water before.
We've had the worst. I still think the worst one was the bubblegum one. It tasted like I was chewing on a tire.
It tasted like cough medicine to me. That's what it tasted.
It was terrible.
I reluctantly drank it because, I like coffee, but it was bad.
Yeah, and even back in the day when we had the crack cream, that foam, nothing could save it.
No,
it was a goner. Nothing could save it. Mike, what are you drinking?
Yeah. Today I am drinking coffee from Gloria Jean. Gloria Jean made my coffee today. It's a brand. It's a brand.
Oh, okay. I'm like, Did you hire someone that I'm unaware of, or?
Yeah, we're at that level where we don't brew our own coffee anymore. We hired somebody to do it for us. No, it's Gloria Jean's coffee. It's hazelnut flavor.
Oh, okay.
I don't like flavored creamers, but I like flavored coffee. Flavored creamers have that really weird, nasty aftertaste. You get that film on your mouth after you drink them most of the time.
You ever tried the Chobani natural creamer?
I have.
It's
And that's
flavored. I think it does less of that than typical regular creamers do.
Yeah, I should offer a little caveat here. It's most flavored creamers, not all, but many of them I can't take. Particularly the hazelnut flavored creamers. I think they're disgusting.
I agree with
But
that.
hazelnut flavored coffee I quite enjoy. So yeah, I'm sipping on that today, and it's about 2:45 in the afternoon. It's that low point in the day, so I have a cup to keep me going.
Yep, I understand that, and I failed, and I'm kind of miserable. So,
well, hopefully our conversation perks you up a little bit. So, what I wanted to do today, so many of our audience knows that we are now on YouTube. So if you haven't checked us out on YouTube, please check us out and like and share and subscribe and all of those things. So we want to kind of break through the YouTube algorithm so our videos are able to go out in front of more people, and we think that the content that we're talking about is worthwhile, but it sometimes gets lost in the great digital cacophony that is YouTube. So every once in a while, though, we get some comments coming in, and periodically we'll share comments here. This is actually the first time we're doing it, so this is the first of hopefully many times that we're going to share a comment that came in from somebody who took the time to watch our podcast on YouTube. And so this comment comes from, I want to make sure that I get the pronunciation.
Don't butcher this.
Andres Villarreal 9271. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. a self-purported atheist. He made several comments on the video, but I want to highlight one, and you and I can just talk about it a little bit, Ryan, and then we'll get to the content for today.
Yeah.
And he was responding to our video from 2 weeks ago,
Okay.
which was the question around God's existence. And you gave reasons for God's existence in that video.
Yeah.
And he says, I am also a presuppositionalist. We talk about
Okay.
presuppositions in that video. He says, and I presuppose that all presuppositionalists are incapable of understanding anything on earth, heaven, the universe, or hell. Make any argument from your presuppositionalism, and my presuppositions destroy you. And now, I don't know if he's trolling us
I don't know
or
what that
anything.
means.
I don't know what the motivation is, but that's what Andres had to say. So how
Sure.
would you respond to him?
So, can you read the first two sentences again? I'm confused.
I am also a presuppositionalist, and I
Okay.
presuppose that all presuppositionalists are incapable of understanding anything on earth, heaven, the universe, or hell. Yeah.
So I'm a presuppositionalist, but I suppose that all presuppositionalists can't understand. So is he claiming it's got to be a joke, right? Because it sounds like he's claiming he can't know anything.
Right.
But I will
How do you-
say that
Yeah,
I'm
how do you
assuming
know
it's a
you
joke.
exist?
Yeah. So I'm assuming that's a joke, but I will say this when it comes to presuppositionalist, I do agree to some extent that those who hold to their two things. A lot of people that hold to their presuppositions, don't do it with reasons, they just sort of do it, right? It's sort of what they grew up with or just sort of fell into, or it's
Yeah.
or almost like an intrinsic grasp at truth that they have no reasons why they hold to it. And if that's what you mean, I agree. Some of those people are very hard to deal with because this is true in the background no matter what. But that leads me to the second point. I think if you're going to have presuppositions, it's perfectly okay, A, to have reasons for it, and B, to argue why your presuppositions are true for you to even hold it in the first place.
Sure.
So I don't believe that if you have presuppositions, it stops you from changing your worldview, because I know plenty of people who had prior belief systems that once examining the truth of reality have changed it for the Christian truth and against the Christian truth,
Sure.
right? So
Sure.
I just think because you have presuppositions, it might make it harder, but it doesn't necessarily make it impossible if you are willing to examine it um,
Yeah.
in a certain light, I should say.
Yeah, and it's impossible not to have presuppositions. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I don't know
Right.
what it means to not have prior beliefs about certain things.
Sure.
Because it seems you would have to have the belief that you don't have prior beliefs. So it automatically you have some type of belief
Yeah.
prior.
And as you acquire more knowledge that is in step with what's true, your presuppositions will change.
Absolutely. No, I
So,
don't think there's anything wrong with that.
yeah.
But I do agree if he's stating that he talks with so many people who are so stuck in their belief
Yeah.
and it doesn't matter what evidence is brought to him, I do agree. If this is what he means, it's not a good thing. And we shouldn't be the kind of people who are like that.
Yeah. Yeah. He also made just a little comment here. I'll just mention this real quick and then we're going to move on. He says, a little hint from an atheist, don't use 5 minutes of my time to talk about a game that I don't understand or care for, played by teams that I could not care if they exist. And to that, I'll just say,
You sound like an ex-Patriots fan.
right. I know. Maybe a little bothered by that. I don't know. Well, and if you don't like it, just hit the skip button or don't listen. I mean, that's fine too. I know a lot of podcasts that just they'll spend like 20 minutes going off just talking about random things that have nothing to do with what the podcast is about. So I don't know. I don't like to be blunt and say get over it, but just get over it. But but anyway, thank you for the comment. Appreciate it. So now let's go ahead and let's challenge some presuppositions that perhaps some people listening or watching are holding. And let's
Sure.
talk about the resurrection of Jesus. So everything in Christianity, and by that we're talking about the historical faith, not some of the new versions of Christianity that are more progressive, that deny specific tenets of Christianity, that use that label, right? But Christianity, as we've understood it historically, roots itself in the resurrection of Jesus. So if you don't have the resurrection of Jesus, you don't have
The
Christianity.
bodily resurrection.
Yes, the bodily resurrection of Christianity. Thank you for adding that qualifier. I appreciate that. And so we're not talking about some weird mystical, metaphorical resurrection, but a real bodily resurrection of Jesus. And so, Ryan, let's just start with this question. Why does the resurrection of Jesus matter so much to Christianity? And I started
Yeah,
to talk about
so
that already, but you know.
well, I think there's a few main reasons why. Yeah, I mean, granted, there's books written on this topic, but let me just give you two that sort of pop into the top of my head. The first is this: it seems as if the God of the Old Testament, that Jesus believed he was sort of a Jewish, held the Jewish background belief, right? That he was a Jew, that the God of the Old Testament vindicated everything that this man claimed to say and be about himself. If the resurrection is true, it seems that God has raised this person from the dead to an everlasting state of glory. And if God thought this man was evil or bad, it doesn't seem, according to their own doctrine, that this would be a plausible conclusion that their heavenly Father would do, or that they believed he would do. So I think that's a huge tell that what this person of Jesus Christ said about himself, um, is vindicated by the God of the Old Testament Jewish belief system. So I think that's a massive thing, right? And secondly, is if Jesus believed in the Old Testament sacrificial system and what he taught and what he held to, his belief was his death would atone for all of humanity's sin in relationship to the Father. That means because of what he has done, which, as I said, was vindicated, it was the only way to atone for the blood of humanity, and that through him and through him alone and what he has done, he's the only way that can get you back to the God of the old, to God, basically, in relationship with him.
Mhm.
And his claim that all of the laws pointed to that conclusion and ended with him, in him, I should say. Like it all pointed to him. And the fact that he could say, Moses wrote about me,
Mhm.
and then God would vindicate him by bringing him to a revivification in a perfect glory sense of his physical body after death. Um, that's a huge statement
Yeah,
from what I
absolutely.
can tell. And it seems not only that's what the disciples grasped from the event,
Mhm.
but the people who still weren't believers also seem to conclude from the event, if it was true, therefore we need to push it down a little more. Um,
Mhm.
and so it's a big thing. We'll put it that way. According to the Jewish belief, that would have been a huge conclusion if what he said was true and this was actually the case.
Yeah, good. Good. Yeah, like Jesus says, he says, when he's talking to his disciples and the crowd in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, I've
Yeah.
not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law.
Like that's
Right?
crazy
And
to
that's
think about.
great. It's a crazy thing to say.
That's a
And
crazy.
the I am statements of in John, like to where the Pharisees wanted to kill him. Like
Yo,
it's
I know,
just,
right?
it's just, and as you were talking, I was thinking about C.S. Lewis's argument for the deity of Jesus.
Yeah.
As you look at the biographical account of Christ and the things that he did, the things that he said, and people like to form Jesus in their own image. Like we talked about that in the social justice Jesus episode. There's this human tendency to do that. But Lewis very clearly says we really have three options. Some would say four options, but primarily three options for who Jesus is. If we assume that he actually existed, right? If we were going based on that prior assumption, that he is either Lord, he's a liar, or he's a lunatic,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
Because for somebody to claim they are divine and to not be, they are out of their mind. They are not in the right headspace. They need to get a psych eval,
Yeah.
right? or they're a liar, which would automatically negate the idea that they were a good moral teacher.
Right.
He,
Yeah,
he can't be now. Or
exactly.
he is exactly who he said he is. And the resurrection authenticates and punctuates that.
Exactly.
Right? And
And I
so,
do find
yeah.
it interesting when the Pharisees come to him and say like in who who's testifying
Mhm.
to you about these things, right? These miracles, all these things that you're doing. Who's standing as witness with you? And I love what he says here because it's savage. He gives them like a trinity of witnesses, right? But
Mhm.
before he says that, he goes, "I don't need a witness."
Mhm.
Like think about that. Like I myself, even though your scripture says you need a witness to testify as true, he goes, "I'm above that. I don't need one." Like that's a crazy statement that when people don't catch that. And he goes, "Fine, let me give you one.
Mhm.
God, my miracles. Oh yeah, your precious prophet Moses, because he everything he did was writing literally about me." Like, not only he goes, I stand above it, but my works do, God your father does, and your prophet Moses does.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, that's savage. Like in my book, that's a savage claim.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if that's what he truly believed and taught, and all of a sudden this man's now running
Yeah.
around in a glorified state after they took him out,
Mhm.
that is a huge stamp according to the
Right.
Jewish belief that
Right.
God's like, no, this guy has my approval on him.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and we also just have to understand the ultimate reason why the religious leaders were pursuing Jesus. Number one, they were trying to discredit him in the eyes of the people.
Sure. Yeah.
But then when that didn't work, they pursued the death of Jesus, getting him killed. And they succeeded in that, right? So, because there is no resurrection without first a death, of course. And so we have to understand that, like, Jesus said these inflammatory and what they believe to be blasphemous things
Yeah.
because he was claiming to be divine. And
Right.
like we said, the resurrection authenticates all of those claims Jesus makes in his earthly ministry. If he's
Mhm.
not resurrected, like Paul says, our faith is in vain.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. We're out of our mind. We're crazy,
And
right?
I think all his opponents understood this is what his claim was in the face of it.
Yeah.
A lot of times you hear is like, that's not what he meant. But like the problem is when your opponents who seek to kill you
Mhm.
interpret it this way, I think we are on good grounds to think like, okay, yes, like this is how, at minimum, people were at least interpreting it. Like it's not like a false interpretation. It's
Sure.
like an interpretation to get out of that. And I still find it fascinating how his disciples still had no clue or understood anything. It's
Yeah.
especially with all the miracles in front of them. That's another part of the story which fascinates
Right.
me.
Right. And we get into chronological snobbery too, and we're like, well, if
Yeah,
I was Peter, I
true,
wouldn't have been
absolutely
that
true.
stupid. But yeah.
Right.
Well, why don't we get into and we all are, let's just be honest,
Yeah.
but let's start getting into the bedrock historical facts
Yep.
of the resurrection, about the resurrection that even skeptical scholars, guys like Bart Ehrman, would agree on. And so, Ryan, can you just lay out for us what are some bedrock historical facts, or what some apologists would call the minimum facts of around the resurrection of Jesus historically?
Yeah, and I think the person who attached this title to it first was Gary Habermas, right? And
Okay.
Dr. Gary Habermas, if anyone has studied the resurrection, if you have not come across Dr. Gary Habermas, you haven't been studying long enough.
Can I make a quick anecdote about
Sure. Yeah, and
Gary
I don't mean to
Habermas?
sound rude with that. It
Yeah,
just is the case. You know what
yeah.
I mean?
But you know what's funny? He is such a great scholar, but he does not talk like a scholar. He doesn't sound like a scholar.
No.
But just based on his voice.
Yeah.
Because I know I know a guy that sounds exactly like him. It's really funny. Anyway, but go ahead.
Yeah, and so he just actually is putting out some of his opus work. I think it's a 4 or 5 part. It's called "On the Resurrection," and he just released his first two, and I waiting for the third one. And so, minimum facts argument. He started recording since like 19 mid 1970s. Every single source in all different languages when it comes to peer-reviewed articles and journals and books on Jesus' resurrection. And I think he has like 6,000 independent sources since then. Like it's crazy. And in his books, I'm pretty sure he has almost 5,000 footnotes in the series of books coming out, which is still mind-blowing to me. You know what I mean? But so an a minimum fact would basically state this. It's first established by an overly abundance of strong evidence, usually by multiply sort of critically ascertained independent lines of argumentation, right? That's the first thing. The second is the vast majority of scholars across like the spectrum who has credentials in the specific field, right? Not just sort of any YouTube dude, but someone who actually has credentials. Say if you're looking into the science of it, physicians who have credentials on this and their reviews, not just drink apple cider vinegar, self-proclaimed physicians. You know what I'm saying? Um, when when these criteria and points are met, it is claimed as sort of a minimum fact or a bedrock fact that almost everyone across the field, critically acclaimed scholars agree upon that these are true. And not only these are true, the growing evidence continues to look favorable on the fact that these are true. So the more that comes out in science and archaeology, it just sort of like grounds it even more. And so
Mhm.
he lays out six. I know in his work, I think he predicts within the next decade and a half, there should be about 12, which is
Wow.
even more fascinating. But I'm just going to go with the six that he gives, even though I think personally I mean, I think there's way more historical facts that he doesn't include in here. But let me give you the six that he gives. The first one is this: Jesus' death by Roman crucifixion. The second, that the disciples truly believed that they had experiences of the risen Jesus after his burial. The
Mhm.
third is that we have the earliest proclamation of the gospel that can be located in Jerusalem within 2 to 5 years, coming from the disciples proclaimed that Jesus bodily rose 3 days after. So that was the earliest proclamation that we know of. Fourth, that the disciples severely had a transformation in belief systems and worldviews and presuppositions. Callback,
Mhm.
when every sort
Yep.
of belief or disposition sort of urged them in the opposite direction.
Right.
Five, the conversion of his half brother James, who we know wasn't a believer in who Jesus was.
Mhm.
And lastly, Paul, Saul of Tarsus, the person who
Yeah.
sought to kill this sect called the Way, and trampled their belief for his harsh and strict Judaism, randomly had an experience of Jesus, and he completely 180'd every presupposition and worldview he's really had to write, what is it, 2/3 of the New Testament, right? Started
Yeah.
most of the churches that we
Yep.
in early Christianity. So
Right.
so
Right.
that's typically the sort of bedrock minimum facts that he argues with.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And one of the things that I find really interesting that all scholars agree on is that there was an empty tomb. Like most
Oh yeah,
scholars
they
seem to agree that there's an empty tomb, which I find amazing. Like, okay, then how do you what do you do? How do you
sure.
explain something like that? Because
Right.
like to close up a tomb like that, like you're dealing with a rock that weighs what, at least 2,000 pounds, something like that.
Yeah.
Like to move the stone to pull the body out, it's a big ordeal.
Yeah.
Um,
But
and
especially the death by Roman crucifixion. I mean, if unless you're a Jesus mythicist, which is very, very small people. I don't know people who still claim Jesus never existed, which in my mind is, I don't want to say like crazy because that's like a psychological disorder, but it's very like, do your history. I don't want to sound mean, but like you need to do better. Um,
yeah, yeah,
but really, other than that, it seems the only worldview that doesn't think Jesus died by Roman crucifixion, given the vast amount of historical extra
mhm.
biblical testimony that we have, are those who belong to the faith of Islam. And it's only because they believe the Quran said so.
That's the only reason. Yeah,
That's really the only reason.
yeah,
Yeah. or they have some sort of swoon theory, but then there's so many problems with that and so many philosophical arguments against the goodness of Allah if that's the case, where he can now deceive and epistemological. I mean, there's a gauntlet of problems if that's the case that a lot of scholars have brought up against these different types of Islamic swoon theories.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, let's turn the corner here and let's take a look at some of the opposing theories to the
Yep,
resurrection. All right, let's take a
sure.
look at that. So we've got, I'll just list these off real quick so our listeners know where we're heading. We have the legend theory. So some argue that the resurrection story was just an embellishment over time, kind of like this big long game of telephone where someone
Right.
whispers in somebody else's ear and it just gets passed on until this, what was just this really normal human guy, he was mythicized, and brought into this legend status over many years. Then there's the fraud theory, the idea that somebody stole the body, right? That Jesus never truly resurrected, that the disciples decided to play hide and seek with Jesus, I guess. I don't know. But there's this fraud theory, the wrong tomb theory,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
idea that I just think that one's funny because this idea that the theory originated because like suddenly the women forgot which tomb Jesus was laid in
yeah.
randomly. And then
Right.
we have two more. There's the alien theory, that the people suggest that there's some sort of alien explanation for the resurrection. We'll get into that a little bit more. And then finally, there's what's called the hallucination theory. But there's just, of all the people that saw the resurrected Jesus, it was just one mass hallucination. Everybody was taking the same drug and saw the same thing. Okay.
Yeah.
And so let's get into the legend theory.
Yeah, before we get into that, Mike, can I add
Yeah.
a thought here that I
Sure.
think is helpful? When looking at the arguments and facts for the resurrection, this is different than the arguments in the first episode of Why Christianity, where I laid them out in deductive form. Now, remember when I said like the goal of this is not to go, I have 100% certainty. It's like,
Sure.
what is the best plausible conclusion to
Right.
these things that we have? And
Right.
the resurrection falls into the same category, but I think there's a strong uh, resurrection is very strong. And so when you look at these historical facts, right,
Hmm.
you don't look at them in deductive form. You look at them in either like inductive or abductive form. And this is what I mean by this. And it depends on how you want to view these two forms of logic. It states this: you gather all the evidence you have, right? And you put it in a pile. And then what you do is you formulate hypotheses. And this is sort of the best way I like to point it out. Say you have hypothesis one, two, three. And you
Hmm.
form these hypotheses that are trying to explain the data. And then what you do is this: you take all the data points and you try to see which hypothesis like fits the data points. But it's not just fitting in any old way. It's not like me when I was 60 pounds heavier trying to get into my new pants now, right? Just try to squeeze in whenever possible. That's not what we're doing. Good evidence, there are certain qualities and kinds of things that make evidence good. And can I just share them with you?
Sure.
Because you're going to see that this is also crucial. It's not, can I just jam in the facts? It's how the facts fit is important to having a plausible conclusion.
Yeah.
And so there's really five main, there's some scholars go six to seven depending, but five main sort of qualities a fact hypothesis needs in order to think it's good evidence, right? Or a fact needs, I should say, to make a hypothesis a good conclusion. That's the way I
Sure.
should say. Well, the first is explanatory scope. Do you want me to explain these briefly, or do you want me to just list them out?
Go ahead. Just explain them.
So
Yeah.
explanatory looks at the quantity of facts accounted for. So if you have one hypothesis one and two, if you have 10 facts, this one only explains one, but this explains nine. We should believe this hypothesis over here, number two, is going to be more true than not because it explains more of the data.
Hmm.
Explanatory power looks for the quality, meaning less effort or vagueness. Don't have to like shove it in and try to get things to work for it. If it can like smoothly and less ambiguously fit in. Plausibility, confidence suggests a certain hypothesis, right?
Hmm.
Less ad hoc mean non-evidenced assumptions. If I don't have to make up random background assumptions in order to get this work, if it just flows in without making up assumptions, it's called less ad hoc. And if illumination, if the hypothesis provides light on all of these other areas
Hmm.
as well, and you're going to find, Mike, I have looked, people have looked, I have no idea what other hypothesis
Yeah.
other than the resurrection fits all of these facts
Hmm.
in a way that other hypotheses can't. It just isn't there. And if
Yeah.
that's the case, I just think we should hold and think that the resurrection is true or even way more plausibly true than these other answers. And I think someone like a Bart Ehrman would just go, I don't know. Something had to have happened with the disciples.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of a lot of where a lot of people conclude is I don't know, maybe something will pop up that we don't know because a lot of these other theories just cannot explain the data. They just
Yeah.
cannot, like the resurrection. So I just wanted to make that clear that it's not just the fact that you can squeeze it in, it's how it's going through the filter that matters.
Mm. Sure. Sure. No, that's good. That's clarifying. It's helpful.
Okay.
So let's look first at the legend theory
Sure.
then. So, you have this belief among some people that it's a very common one. I've talked to many people who hold this belief
Yeah.
that, all right, how do we know that this just became something that evolved into something different than what it was over a period of time, like anything else? How do we know the resurrection originated, this belief in the resurrection of Jesus originated with the disciples and not
Yeah.
some of these later myths? Because, I mean, there are other cases of someone coming into the world, believing they're God incarnate, dying for the sins of the world, and those types. It was not a new story, but
Yeah.
um, this is something that Christians, you and me, would believe is true. So, what do you say to somebody who's like, well, this is just in the category of these other later myths?
So it's well, so I always the example of like the telephone game always comes up,
Mhm.
right? Where you tell someone a message in the beginning and
Mhm.
then later on all of a sudden it's just obscure message and I'm usually the person that makes up something random to really screw
Right.
up the whole game.
Hmm.
Um, I think that's a terrible analogy for this. If you think about it, what
Well, it's
just
not a good argument.
no, it's not a good argument, but
Not
just
a good
just
argument at
think
all.
about this for example. These are the disciples who could just go back to being Jewish without any punishment or financial harm or anything. Anything done to their worldview, just going, I like screwed up for 3 years. Like, okay, let me just go back to my old life, back to my
Right.
hometown where my family resides. Perfectly
Right.
fine. They continued it until, like, without financial gain,
Hmm.
until a lot of them were, a lot of them died for it. A lot of them were beat. A lot of them were put in jail for the belief.
Yep.
And it's just like, think about that if that's
Right.
the case. So I always, granted, it's not the best analogy, but I always tell people, like, say you're poor and you're hungry, and someone sits you down and plays, hey, we're gonna play a telephone game, but here's the kicker. If you guys get it correct at the end, I'm gonna give each of you $20 million,
Hmm.
right? You better believe that answer is coming out correct at the end.
Oh, of course.
I wouldn't mess it up. I'd be like, I want $20 million. I'd invest in some Bitcoin or something like that. But you see what I'm saying? Like, once you
Yeah.
start adding different qualifications to the game, you can see how the game wouldn't be screwed up
Yeah.
at all when it comes to the end. But I don't like that analogy. I think it's a flawed analogy because I can just add extra
Sure.
nuanced points to get a better analogy. But let's just talk, Ren. Like I said, the analogy doesn't work. I think we should just get down to the bare minimum. Like, think about this, the legend facts, right? Like you said, it's an embellishment of a story over a period of time. Well, I have 4 reasons why I think legends just doesn't work. First of all, is the story can be traced back to the original disciples, and it can be developed over time. It is historically recognized as false. Like I said, even Bart Ehrman agrees that this was coming from the disciples centered in Jerusalem within 2 to 5 years. This isn't a later development. You look at 1 Corinthians 15, and Mike Licona gives 9 arguments why the language, the pattern of it, was extremely, extremely early and probably the earliest creed that is already going around the early church in Jerusalem from the very start. So to say like 100 years later, the story that Jesus rose from the dead is just blatantly historically false. And the other ancient writings within 100 years also claim that are extra biblical that this is what the Christians believe. So the
Hmm.
fact that people try to say it's an embellishment they haven't looked into the history of it whatsoever. Second, Paul came to believe in Jesus' resurrection apart from the testimony of the disciples.
Right.
He sought to stomp it out, and independent of being convinced by the disciples, he claimed he saw Jesus and was taught by Jesus himself,
Hmm.
independent of this fact, right? Same thing with James, right?
Yeah.
So the fact that you think that this is a story that came 300 years later or 150 years later, it just isn't historically correct. And I know of no actual scholar in a field that thinks the embellishment is a good hypothesis for the data points that we have. It just, I don't know of one in my that's actually credentialed in the field of study.
Yeah, and I appreciate the point that you brought out with regard to the disciples because, like you said, they had nothing intrinsic um, outside of the Holy Spirit. There was no other selfish intrinsic motivation
Yeah,
for the disciples to conjure up this made up story of Jesus. If they were going to make up something, if they were going to spread this fiction that Jesus had risen from the dead, the story that we read in the Gospels would not read the way that it is because
no, not at
there's
all.
this there's what's called the criterion of embarrassment.
Seriously? Yeah,
Yeah, and we don't like to publicize stories that would make us look bad, right? So if the
right.
disciples were to recreate a story that was a fiction, they wouldn't have created a story where they were wimps, right? They wouldn't
Exactly, right?
they wouldn't have done that at all. They would have created a story where they're the heroes, where they stood by Jesus' side when he was killed and
Hmm.
all these types of things. And they would have concocted a story where Jesus didn't get crucified on a cross, but he overtook the Roman government and ushered in a new political reign for Israel. That's what the story would have read as.
Right.
And so if we're talking about something that's a fiction, I'm just afraid that it just doesn't comport with the mindset that people had in first century Jewish antiquity.
Right,
It
exactly.
doesn't.
And I think that's a big point you made here, Mike. We oftentimes, when we read the Gospels or the story of Jesus, we are viewing it through sort of this 21st century lens that we have
Yeah.
in like in white Central America, right? And I'm not doing any like woke sort of language here. It's just the filter we put on because we see things in our everyday world that have trained us to look at things at a certain lens. But if you step back and go, hold on, this is a first century Palestine Jew who held that the Old Testament was God's word
Hmm.
and lived in that time and had a worldview that filtered things in that time. Why are we shocked that if people like I'm not shocked that people misunderstand things, in my opinion, but I think that's our problem. We
Sure.
haven't been taught to look at it in the correct lens and get rid of some of our presuppositions. Haha, always going back to that. When it
Oh
comes
yeah.
to the if you look at it through his eyes and how that worldview saw it, you would understand things in a different way. Like to your point, the fact like a lot of people might go like, oh yeah, I would tear myself down. That happens a lot in the movies and in comedy, but that's not how they worked back then in their culture.
No.
The fact that they would embarrass themselves is unheard of, especially propagating a brand new religious system in a world that where you have in a world that it was okay to stomp you out because power and money is what mattered. Like
Yeah.
when you see it through that lens, the fact that they would write bad about themselves shouldn't be interpreted in the way we would understand, and it's okay thing to do in our day and age. Uh,
Absolutely. Yep.
so yeah, we gotta start viewing it correctly through the first century lens, in my opinion.
Gotcha. All right, so let's keep going. Let's do another theory. Let's talk about the fraud theory, the idea that someone took Jesus' body. Okay, so what are the problems with this idea? The idea that the most common theory is that the disciples stole the body of Jesus. So,
Yeah.
what are the problems with this idea? Let's just start
Well,
there.
so think about that accusation in Scripture, Mike. Think how stupid this is. Um, and this is why I think it's a historical fact, and I think it will become bedrock one of these days. We have early testimony, not only from the disciples, but early testimony that the story that the guards fell asleep at the tomb and then went and then they took the money from the priests in order to claim to say they fell asleep and the disciples stole the body.
Yeah, who's moving that 2,000-ton tomb and not waking up the guards?
Right, but besides that, Mike, if you're asleep, how in the world did you even know the disciples stole the body?
Well, that too, of
You're
course.
asleep. And this was promulgated as the story from the beginning, and we have no extra testimony that the disciples made this up. This is what has been all around since
Yeah,
the very beginning
from the beginning, yeah.
about how nonsense that story is.
Hmm.
And that tells me, right, like that one, the tomb was empty, how stupid that story is. But the claim that the disciples stole the body is absolutely nonsense, especially when you're telling me you were asleep and somehow you know. Could you imagine taking that to a court of law? You sound like an idiot. But let me give you just like three other reasons why I think the fraud theory of the disciples stole the body is nonsense. The first is this: the disciples had a sincere belief that they saw the risen Jesus. If they took the body, why in the world did they pull a 180 and suffer for this stupid lie that they put forth when there was no riches and there was
Right.
physical harm?
Yep.
This doesn't make any
Do you
sense
ever
to
do
me.
you ever see that Babylon V video where like Peter and the disciples are gathering around a fire and he's like, "Hey, I got an idea. Why don't we like steal the body of Jesus
No,
and
I haven't.
so we'll steal the body of Jesus and then we're gonna go and we're gonna suffer and die." And everyone's like shouting and screaming like, "Yeah, wow!" like
I haven't. I haven't seen
it's
that.
but I'm not doing the video justice. I'm not explaining it well, but it's pointing to the absurdity of this idea that the disciples, with full knowledge that Jesus was dead and stay dead,
Yeah.
right? That they would go through all of this trouble and that they would propagate a lie, knowing that they had stolen the body and they died for it. There's no way they would have died for a lie and Peter martyred upside down, many scholars and historians believe.
Sure.
And all
Yeah.
the other disciples, like Thomas, I think was martyred in India for his belief. He was impaled with arrows. Like all of these stories you read of the original disciples going to their brutal end.
Right.
Why they could have just ended up by saying, "Just kidding,
Yeah. Right.
just
Exactly.
kidding. We
Right.
stole it. We don't
Exactly.
really believe this." Okay.
But
Yep.
not only does like I'm going to talk about the fraud theory of the disciples uh or someone else, right? Not only, so let's take these two categories, disciples or someone else. Not only does it not explain the disciples, but it doesn't explain Paul or James either. Like we
Sure.
have two men who already didn't believe you.
Mhm.
What are you doing? Are you weekend at burning Jesus' body on the road to Damascus in front of James in order to get the people who already hated you and didn't believe it not to actually believe you? Like what? Like it can't explain that at all. Like I don't like the if they stole the body, how are you persuading these two men that Jesus who was dead is then
Yeah,
therefore
one of them
alive?
is Jesus' half brother.
And
You
one
know
of
how
them
much
knows
he,
what Jesus
you know
looks
how
like
much he
alive.
didn't want to believe Jesus was divine? Are you kidding
I
me? He's his
know.
brother.
It's just it's just so bizarre that people think someone stole the body and it persuaded all of these people, especially
Yeah,
if they think the disciples
exactly.
stole the body.
Yeah.
And they believe the story of the guards because the guards were asleep. How in the world could you even know that they stole the body? It just makes no
Yep.
sense.
Oh yeah. All right, let's get to the next theory.
Sure.
Let's do that. Let's go to the wrong tomb theory. Like the women got turned around, and so did the disciples. They went to the wrong tomb. Jesus had been dead the entire time. Someone else was moved out of their tomb, or whatever the theory happens to be. It was an empty tomb, but it was not Jesus' tomb. Um, so let's ask this: could the resurrection belief have originated from people simply going to the wrong tomb?
So,
Is it plausible?
so I think no, I don't. So the answer is no. Well,
Yeah.
so the answer is that no. Next, no. So I
Yeah.
think the wrong tomb theory assumes the wrong thing. This is what I mean by this. It assumes the empty tomb convinced the disciples that he has risen.
Ah, okay.
The empty tomb, as far as I know, didn't convince them, according to the Gospels.
No.
Seeing Jesus convinced them.
Yeah.
So even if they went to the wrong tomb, it does nothing to articulate the fact that all of these people, James, Paul, the disciples, all of them believe they saw the risen
Yeah.
Jesus and ate and talked and walked and were
Yeah.
convinced that you could go and talk to 500 other
Yeah.
people to be witness to your
Yeah.
experience whatsoever. And we know for a fact, like Mary, she saw the empty tomb, and the first thing wasn't, oh, he's risen. Her response was,
Someone stole him.
who took him?
Who took the body?
Yeah, so the people say they went to the wrong tomb, I think assumes that the empty tomb was what convinced everyone. And I just
Yeah.
think that it's not what the biblical testimony is whatsoever. The fact that they saw Jesus is what convinced them that Jesus rose from the dead, not the empty
Yeah.
tomb.
Yeah, and I don't know of any, maybe you know of some sources, Ryan, but do any historical sources actually claim the women or the disciples went to the wrong tomb?
Not till later on.
Okay.
But I think I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. I have that somewhere in my notes. I think it's not till a few hundred years later that
Okay.
this was like
But not within their time period.
oh, not within at all the first 150 years.
Okay.
No, no, that it's not a later established. It was an argument established way later on.
Yeah. So I'm thinking
Um,
like historical sources, someone like Josephus saying, "Oh yeah, they got, they
yeah,
went
no,
to the
I
wrong
not that I
tomb."
know of,
Okay.
not that I have found.
All right. Let's go on to the alien theory. I'm not familiar at all with this one really.
Sure.
But some people suggest an alien explanation for the resurrection. All right. So Ryan, can you get into that a little bit? Can you explain
Yeah.
the theory and how does it compare to the historical evidence?
So it's funny. I put this in um, because I am teaching on aliens this week. So I thought it'd be funny
Okay.
to put that in because what we are experiencing in a modern time of these UFO encounters and these abductee and contactee encounters, especially within the occult practices, right? These Nordics or the Greys, what they call them, are giving a lot of information about Jesus randomly, which I find very fascinating, and I don't think a coincidence. And so a lot of people are thinking, wow, if this is true, what if aliens like stole the body? How are we to argue that aliens didn't steal the body? Well, first of all, the alien theory that the alien stole the body does nothing to deny, in a sense, Jesus's resurrection. In
Sure.
a say, right? It's to deny the cause of who took the body.
Right.
So claiming that the aliens stole the body, not and it wasn't God as the cause of it. Does that make sense? Like
Right.
they took them
It's
back
not
to
the Holy Spirit reanimating Jesus'
sure,
body.
right.
It's
Um,
an outside source. Yeah.
Secondly, I would argue extensively, which I'm going to,
Hmm.
that aliens in the extraterrestrial hypothesis is logically impossible to not only that they exist, it's so implausible that they can't ever, if they do exist, can't ever reach Earth, so something weird is happening. So the idea that aliens in a mothership came, I don't even think is even close to being plausible. I mean, like very, like way past the Milky Way galaxy as
Yeah.
implied.
But that's a framework that's used to interpret the entirety of Scripture too. Like
Yeah, and
like
so
like aliens parted the Red Sea. Aliens like it was
yeah,
like when Jesus ascended into heaven after he gives the Great Commission. It's a UFO that's beaming him up.
yeah,
It's
exactly. And so
crazy.
in my mind, I'm just like the fact that I don't think aliens actually exist in the way we sort of naturalistically defined it, and I think the arguments are harsh, like violently against them. Um, I think the alien theory is just silly in my mind if that's the case. But
Okay.
I think there's more things. One, um, even if aliens stole the body, it can't explain the disciples' experiences. It can't explain Paul. It can't explain James. It can't explain the women. It can't explain the five. I can't explain the data. All they say is that aliens took the body. Now you might go aliens sort of revivified Jesus, right? And so you have, in a sense, a resurrection, but you don't have the kind of resurrections the disciple were claiming. And then you also have then a false prophet because Jesus claimed that his father in heaven would. You have like C.S. Lewis, you have a lunatic or a liar. You have this conclusion.
What if the Father in heaven sent the aliens?
Well, I also make the joke like I'm like technically Jesus was an alien, depending
True,
how you
he's
want
not
to
from this
define it.
world.
He
Yeah,
wasn't from this
true,
world.
true.
So I think the alien theory is just so highly, not only does it not explain the biblical data, I just think the fact that you think
Yeah.
these naturalistic sort of green little men in flying saucers came to and are existing because things weird are happening now is just so highly implausible
I'm
that
just picturing ET coming in and
yeah, no, and
taking
I think we'll
Jesus.
talk about this after I'm done teaching this next course on why I think the interdimensional hypothesis.
We should argue about whether or not aliens exist. We talked about doing that as an episode. We should do that.
Oh,
I'll I'll
I would love to do it. That would
I'll
be
get us. I don't care either way. I really don't. But
okay.
I'll get a stack of arguments together about why I think they exist.
Sure,
Why
sure.
not?
That'd be fun.
Yeah.
I think we could I think it would be fun to present your arguments, present my arguments, and then we just sort of have a funny conversation back and forth.
Yeah, I think that would be fun. That'd
Yeah,
be
I would do
good.
that. I'm 100% in for that.
All right. So why don't we plan to do that for a future episode? So
Okay,
take
that'd
note
be
of that,
perfect.
listeners. If we don't follow through on that, you could harangue us, harass us, whatever you want to do. So let's get to the last theory, hallucination theory. All right. So this is just a really interesting one and a difficult one for me to wrap my mind around, especially since the people that make this argument will appeal to science,
Hmm. Yeah.
biology, right?
Yep.
To how the world works. And yet they make an argument that defies that, that doesn't sync up with that at all. So
Yeah. Right.
you'll have one person, or maybe in rare instances, you'll have two people experience the same hallucination. I've never heard of any instance where you have 400 to 500 people all experiencing the same hallucination collectively. But
Yep.
there's this theory out there that says anyone who saw Jesus, they they were hallucinating. They were not actually seeing a bodily resurrected Jesus Christ.
Mhm.
They were simply seeing a figment of their imagination. They were on something. I don't know what they were on,
Yeah.
but they were on something.
Yeah. Right.
So I know what you believe, so I'm not going to ask if the resurrection of Jesus could be explained by mass hallucinations, but let me just ask, why do you think that explanation is inadequate?
Um. Yeah. So I have done a lot of research on this, and I know a lot of people have done from peer-reviewed
Mhm.
um, doctors and psychologists on this. So first is this that I actually disagree. I don't know if you made this point, Mark, but Mike, that there has never once been a recorded, even though they've tried, where people have hallucinated simultaneously. Here's the key here, yet had this identical hallucination.
Identical is the word.
So
Yeah.
they've put people in rooms and they've given group hallucinations, but everything was distinct and different information, everything. I'm talking about
Yeah.
people, different places, locations, belief systems, prior dispositions, and
Gotcha.
they all come together to have a hallucination, and it's identical in all of the data points. Not
Right.
only have they tried that for decades, they have never yet once been able to produce that end result.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so I know Gary Habermas in this book right here, that one that just released on the resurrections, also brings that point up. He's like, I can't find it. I just can't find it. And so I think the medical, if you're coming from a scientific realm, the medical data points to the fact that what they have claimed to experience, and all of them in the same room, the same details, and all of the data points, it just so far has not been proven to be medically possible.
Right.
Just isn't. Um, but here's the kicker. Not only has our modern medicine shown so far that it's just not the case, it
Mhm.
doesn't explain a lot of things.
Right.
One, it doesn't explain the empty tomb, unless you want to say everyone, even the people who weren't believers, hallucinated the empty tomb. Good luck arguing that, right?
Right.
Yeah, and
Right.
you can always explain some implausible logical possibility, but I need evidence. I need not ad hoc evidence, as I talked about in the beginning for it. So it doesn't explain any of that. It doesn't explain Paul. It doesn't explain James. And like I said, there's too many variances in these incidences that are identical to explain in the data um, of both men and women, individuals and groups, attested by friend and foe, hard-hearted people, soft-hearted people, indoors, outdoors, over a long period of time, eating food where the food isn't there anymore. There's just so many coincidences. And in fact, I am confident, and I can say this with the years of research I've done on this topic, I think the hallucination is agreed upon as the worst hypothesis for the data that we have. Yet somehow
Oh,
it's very popular in the sort of social media sphere. And I can give you a handful of scholars who aren't believers that say we need to just reject the hallucination hypothesis. Um,
okay.
Look somewhere
Okay.
else because it just is not a good hypothesis. Um, and so yeah, I would just argue it can't explain the data, the tons of data, and the
Mhm.
medical research so far has tried to do it and it can't do it.
Yep.
It just
Yep.
can't do it.
Yep.
Um, so yeah, that's I just because of that, I think the hallucination hypothesis doesn't explain. It's just terrible, in my
Yep.
opinion. It just doesn't
Yep.
work.
Yep. And there's one theory I don't think you mentioned in your talk. At least maybe I didn't catch it in the slides. You had a lot of slides.
Yeah.
Um, but there's the swoon theory as well that Jesus,
Oh yeah.
he just passed out. He lost a lot of blood and he was just really badly injured. But he didn't really die. He didn't really die.
Yeah.
And to that, I would just say if you're listening or you're watching and you hold to that theory, it's an interesting theory. But if you study anything about Roman crucifixion, they didn't invent crucifixion, but man, they perfected it. So when the Romans crucified somebody, they knew without a shadow of a doubt that that person was dead. Their heart was not beating. There was no life in them whatsoever. And Jesus, I mean, looking at the biblical accounts, he's stabbed in the side and water comes out, right? So, yeah. Anyway,
Yeah, and the
that's
swoon
another theory.
theory, I think the swoon theory was first sort of brought up, and I believe the early 70s or 60s. So let me state that again. The swoon theory was trounced in the early 70s,
I see.
where they put a stamp and go, okay, this doesn't work.
We're not going to even try this
Because
anymore.
now you have this person who was brutally beaten, somehow survived, and then 3 days later, with the scars and the blood and half conscious, comes and says, this is the resurrected body, I'm the risen Christ. The first thing you would do is get medical help, right?
Yeah.
And so because of the, it really was stomped out in the early 70s where people were like, I don't believe this anymore. But what happened is,
Would have been is a zombie Jesus
yeah,
moment,
right,
right?
exactly.
Right? He
But
just comes out barely
and
alive.
so we see the swoon theory appear in early Islamic thought. Not necessarily that Jesus survived it, but Jesus was replaced. And either A, he was brought up to be next to God, next to Allah, I should say, or B, he lived a normal life elsewhere and died like a normal human. He just didn't take front and center as a prophet anymore.
He was replaced?
Yeah, so there's a couple theories. He was replaced by Simon, who held his cross, or they suggest that God made either Simon or made Judas to look either in physical form or blind the people who were there. And they crucified Judas or Simon instead of Jesus, and
Oh, they
Jesus,
replaced they replaced him
they
before he
replaced
was
him. So
crucified.
either way, you have God causing a delusion
Yeah.
to people around there, not really for the sake of atonement or any justifiable reason. Once again, you have God causing a delusion, which I would argue would be a lie, in order to get someone else brutally murdered instead of those who were convicted of the crime. And so I think you have so many moral issues when it comes to God literally lying to the world. Not only that, he caused hundreds of millions of people to believe a falsehood
Yeah.
by doing this thing. And it wasn't from our own regard of understanding the information wrong. You purposely transformed these delusions in order for us to then believe falsehoods. And that's just a notch on what is a goodness of the necessarily good creator, if
Yeah.
I've ever heard one. But
Mhm.
that's another conversation for another day. So yeah, the swoon
Yeah.
theory has a long history to it and different ways to look at it.
Right.
But
Right.
it just the modern swoon theory, I just think was stomped out in the 70s when realizing you have it's like when Ultron walks in the age of Ultron, trying to like Jesus like coming, I'm here, I'm good. Like it's just
Right.
not going to
Right. Right.
convince anyone that this is the glorified state that the Old Testament God promised.
Nope. Nope. And he still had the scars on his hands and his feet, but he wasn't
Yeah,
coming out like a zombie.
exactly.
Yeah. All right. Well, Ryan, I had fun talking about the resurrection, and
Yeah,
listeners,
absolutely.
watchers, I hope you found this conversation enjoyable and edifying and challenging. Please be sure to like and subscribe, and also share. That just helps get the word out and gets more people in front of this podcast. And so, if this was something that was beneficial to you, just take that moment to like it, to share it. And again, we want to remind you that we're also on YouTube, so you can find us at The Caffeinated Christian on YouTube. We publish new episodes every Wednesday, and we're periodically putting up new content and shorts and things like this. And it's super helpful if you just take a moment to head over there and take a look and just like what you see. And if you have comments or thoughts or opinions, you can reach out to us through YouTube or through Facebook or Instagram. That is at The Caffeinated Christian, at The Caffeinated Christian. You could also send us a text. There's so many ways to get a hold of us. If you have thoughts or ideas, or you have suggestions on a future episode, we would love to hear from you. But until then, have a great day.